Uh, Got to say, Maria Feaster is here for a second time. She's on altar guild duty, and she'll be pleased to know I'm going to deviate a little bit from 8 o'clock, so you're not going to hear the same show twice. And besides, as other veterans of the Late Show know, it's always a different show at the Late Show. Better jokes and what have you. So I'm just kidding. But where I want to deviate is that something I really wanted to mention, but did not have the time to get into at 8 o'clock, was Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Just to note, so because that's not part of the sermon, but I just want to say a word about it. He writes in there, being strong in the Lord, the strength of his power, the whole armor of God, so you may stand against the wiles of the devil. And he writes, for our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil. What he's talking about is the system. And that is what, the system which oppresses us, the system which sets us against each other. It's why Jesus says, love your enemies, because he knows if you kill the Romans, what's going to happen? Someone else is just going to take their place and become, use the rules of that system. So love your enemies. Don't play that game. Don't become involved in it, which is ironic because it's what the church does. It despises the temple culture, but then, as we know in its history, it becomes that. So, interesting, but we're not going into Ephesians. Where we are going is eventually into the gospel. And I want to start out by saying this. And you may deduce that I just had too much time to think over vacation because I've been thinking about coming back in this sermon text for, 2+ weeks. But to start this statement, as our current educational controversies demonstrate, there is a rather vociferous portion of the population, and as is usually the case, I think by the evidence it is a vociferous minority, that prefers its U.S. history to be neat and clean and free of problematic issues. As a historian, I can tell you that's absolutely impossible. But issues that force one to reconsider our present situation in the light of a more thorough and inclusive examination of our past, an examination which exposes, for example, in the current debate, how it is that slavery became synonymous with race, and then how racism became embedded across myriad systems, right? The systems, and in numerous institutions. That's a mouthful. Very proud of that statement. Wordsmithed it, was perfect. But now, an interesting verse from our appointed text, the passage, John's 6th chapter. John writes, because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So now, to answer the question that I hope is forming in your minds about what possible connection could exist between my opening statement about history and that verse in John, allow me to continue by making 2 observations. The first is this. Whatever the Gospel of John is or is not, and whatever its purpose, it at least reflects or reveals, if you will, the theological upheavals, the controversies, and the progressions of thought that are present not at the time of Jesus' ministry. And I also want to add here, the words of Jesus in John's Gospel are not words that were spoken by Jesus. These are John's words. So they're not the controversies and progressions of thought that were present in Jesus' time, but that exist within the community to which or about which John is writing. And that is somewhere around the year 100, though debate continues to place the date of John's original version anywhere from the year 85 to the year 125, and yours truly tends to favor a later date than most. Thank you for asking. The second is about a misconception that we have about the history of the early church, which again is a case where many prefer to have it contained in a very neat and clean package that does not force one to reconsider or rethink what it is that we think we know about God the church, and the meaning of Jesus, and, well, Christianity. We like to think, or without thinking, as in perhaps we just accept without a second thought, the notion that the kernel of our beliefs, the essence of what we know as Christianity, can be traced directly back to the beginning. It is the same thing that was possessed by the apostles as they moved out from Jerusalem, and though it was challenged by this heretical movement and that heretical movement through its time in history, it has, by God, remained unchanged and is always true to the heart and mind of Jesus. Again, that is a serious misconception. According to writers like Walter Bauer, William Prinner, and our Wednesday morning favorite Bart Ehrman, the earliest Christian movement was launched primarily on what today the church would consider heresy. That is, it was launched on belief or opinion that is contrary to what has become the established orthodoxy of Christian doctrine. An examination of the historical record of the many, many texts, the many letters, the many gospels that are beyond those that were admitted to the canon, proves that heretical beliefs were co-equal to the Orthodox Christian belief and in many communities predated orthodoxy. The earliest followers of the way embraced many meanings of Jesus. I mean, as we know, even the four Gospels that made it into the New Testament, and that's making it into a New Testament that comes 300 years after the Gospel of John is written, each present a radically different version of Jesus. But the other writings, like the earliest Gospel, that of Thomas, or the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or the Acts of Paul and Thecla, another Wednesday morning favorite, and the Acts of Pilate, just to name a few, were all embraced by certain regions and would have spawned Christianities that are so much different. So within the earliest Christian movement, you could find some Christians who believed that Jesus was both divine and human, both God and man. You could find some who believed he was completely divine and not human at all. You could find some that believed he was just full flesh and blood and adopted by God, not divine. That's the Gospel of Mark. Some thought two beings existed in one body, one being the human Jesus, the other being the divine Christ, who inhabited that body until just before his death. My God, why have you abandoned me? Think about it. The biblical witness even reminds us that other ideas were out there. Paul, for instance, in his genuine letters, continually argues with communities that are following teachings that are espoused by other apostles who had come to visit them, and in his, thought, were false teachers. But now focusing on John, what scholars call the Proto-Orthodoxy evolved over time. And in fact, there's strong evidence that the original Gospel of John was first used in the early 2nd century as supporting what are now considered the heresies of Valentinianism and Gnosticism in general. Just as, for example, the Gospel of Mark was used to support Marcion and his ideas. But it was only a little later in the century, when the Gospel of John was applied by men like Irenaeus and Origen, that John was used by the emerging orthodoxy, or the Proto-Orthodoxy, as Bart Ehrman describes it, to stifle its opposition, to claim that its views had always been the majority position, and that's the Christian historian Eusebius talking, and that its rivals were and always had been heretics who willfully chose to reject the true belief. John writes, because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. The Gospel of John is telling us more than we think we know. And the first letter of John in its 2nd chapter echoes a similar sentiment. That writer says, they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But by going out, they made it plain that none of them belonged to us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and all of you have knowledge. I write to you not because you do know the truth, do not know the truth, but because you do know it. As my earlier observation infers, is John describing the first departures, the earliest winnowing out of those in his community who could not come to terms with the emerging orthodoxy, with those first attempts at doctrinal purity, of doctrinal conformity? I believe so. And I'm also left to wonder what we have lost by the suppression of so many ideas as they relate to our understanding of who Jesus was and the true meaning of his life and death. But this little exercise is not really about the early Christian movement. It is about the present. Because I've been thinking a lot about that process of departure, of the leaving of the sheepfold, to turn yet another Johannine phrase. And specifically, what is on my mind this morning is the current state of Christendom. Its hierarchy and polity, its theologies and its groupings, right? Its denominations, its tribes. In short, the totality of the body of Christians and their beliefs, which I also want to add as a footnote, is never to be confused with Christianity, which is the movement that grows out of Jesus' ministry and teaching and mission. But that's another sermon. Now, in the past, I have been assailed for my candor, or perhaps for my lack of bedside manner, when conjecturing about the future of that enterprise, Christendom, specifically where the fate of our own denomination is concerned. And I've spoken openly about its eventual demise, as has our bishop. But I have never done it without looking eagerly and hopefully as to what is coming next. It always bothers me that among my colleagues who wring their hands, it appears I'm the only one who actually believes in death and resurrection. But I don't want to dwell on the facts as played out in our shrinking numbers across the board in the Episcopal Church USA. And by the way, for the record, diocesan statistics, the Episcopal parishes in this county alone have lost 50% of their attendance since 2010. But I don't want to deal in that because ultimately those numbers don't matter. And we'll talk about why I think that in the near future. Besides, as is the case with all saints, and this wide net of ministries in which we have participated and yet will, both known, unknown, celebrated, feared, or ignored, we are beginning to understand and demonstrate to our community, to the diocese, and most important, to each other, what it is that the movement is calling us to be and do, and as such we are beginning to imagine what the next evolution of this parish could be. But instead I want to get at this thought of departure by looking at why people, in John's words, do not go about with us anymore. And even more significantly, why some do not even look us up in the first place. And so much of that has to do with the earmarks of Christendom, our theology, our doctrine, our polity, our hierarchy, and the like. But mostly our doctrine, the things we believe. I want to start small and start locally. And I want to start with those who still are going about with us. In my own conversations over the years with members of the parish, I have discovered that many of us are not only heretical, but have wandered quite far off the doctrinal page. I still recall one absolutely delightful exchange following one of our Wednesday morning Bible studies. An older member looked at me across her cup of coffee and said, "Father, I have to confess, I don't believe any of this." And of course I smiled and replied, "Hey, that's okay. I don't believe any of this either, because it isn't about belief after all. It's about faith, which ultimately is an action based in love, not an intellectual exercise or assent, but an act of love toward and for another." So I absolved this person of just going about with us, how to say this, just for the coffee and fellowship and friendship. But I find that's the case with a good number of us. We come for the friendship, we come for the socializing, some beyond that for the community projects. And that's just fabulous, because I know that in each one in that number that they are still a child of God and loved lavishly by God, however the force of love and light might be understood by them, even if not at all. And I got to say, in the final analysis, I think they are the lucky ones, the most blessed among us. Now, some of us are going about, but are troubled. We're offended, as were the disciples that John described. And in some way, I think it's because those members who are in this tribe are conflicted over the same beliefs and traditions that others have been able to leave by the wayside. And they have drawn lines in the sand that they cannot cross. Suffice it to say that I fear that they do not quite enjoy their coffee as much as the others. But I pray that the day will come when they can. Maybe a second cup as well. Then there are those who over the years have not been able to continue to go about with us. The conflict and offense is usually one side of the same coin. For some, I assume it is also a matter of lines they have drawn. But rather than reflect on why that line might be there, they choose to move on instead. I say assume because in most cases they're not willing to talk about the conflict they feel, which is regrettable. For others, it is a matter of our doctrine, of our teaching, or the perceptions that surround those matters, maybe even a sense of guilt. I've been told by some that they just cannot believe, no matter how hard they try, even to attempt to adapt a very basic belief in God, even a broadly defined God as undefinable. It makes them feel as if they could not belong and still be true to themselves. And for the sake of time, I want to take those individuals and make them part of a larger subgroup, which is the largest group of all, those who have not even considered going about with us in the first place, and for myriad reasons. And here's the warning: I am going to be grossly oversimplifying a very complex issue here. But these are the ones who view the stories that we tell, the doctrines that we put forward, as nothing more than children's stories. And again, I'm oversimplifying. Stories that even if they had sampled Christianity are and would be quickly dismissed and outgrown as one does other magical fantasies about Santa or the Tooth Fairy or an honest politician. And rather than saying, well, science and postmodernism has done in the church, done us no favors, or that those things are the root cause of disinterest in things Christian, I believe that the church need look no further than its own refusal to change for its failure to inspire and sustain new disciples, right? New disciples, not necessarily members. I mean, we expect people to come to us at a specific time. We expect them to adhere to our forms of worship. We expect them to recite our creeds. We expect them to adopt our belief systems, to conform, as we swear in our vows of every vestry person, deacon, priest, or bishop, to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him, or even came to him in the first place, I would add. We have refused to evolve, and the world has outgrown us. We also have this lesson today from the book of Joshua. Let me set the scene. Joshua and the Israelites have arrived in the Promised Land. They are at rest, as it says in chapter 23, the previous chapter. They are at peace with all of the nations and tribes that surround them. And Joshua, realizing that they have arrived and realizing that his time of service is coming to an end, gathers everyone around to ask them this burning question. After he recounts the marvelous things that God has done for them, and Betsy, you didn't mention it, but the missing verses, 2b through 13, I'm not going to squawk about skipping them this time. But after he has recounted all that God has done, he asks them, are you ready to give up all of those other gods? Are you ready to give up the gods your ancestors worshipped in Egypt? The one that your ancestors worshipped in those places we stopped along the way? Are you ready to give up the gods that you grew up with when we lived among the Ammonites? And will you instead serve the God that set you free? That's the question for the church. As we face a new beginning in this brave new world that is dying to hear good news and is waiting for liberation from that system as well. Are we willing to give up the gods that our ancestors made, as summarized in our doctrines and traditions? Are we willing to give up the God that our culture has created and promoted, especially the one the system has given us? Are we willing to give up the God that we fashioned in our childhood, the God of nostalgic hope to recreate the past? Are we willing to give up the God who is magician, scolding parent, judge? And if we are ready to do that, are we willing to serve the God who is simply love and follow that love wherever it might lead us into this undiscovered country, into this future so ripe with potential? Can we go out as perhaps the first apostles did? Can we leave the safety of our temple and go and find out where Jesus is busy, where he is healing and reconciling, where he is loving for the sake of love and for no other reason or motive? And then can we join him with no strings attached? Can we put aside what we think is so important about church or for the church? Can we let go of all of that on the chance that we just might rediscover, and perhaps for the first time, the one for whom the church was given its purpose and mission, a mission we have forgotten? A few years back, when once a month we were trying something a little different at 10:30, a handful of us gathered on the lower level, and some of you here may remember, we watched a TED Talk. The speaker was Alain de Botton, and he suggested nothing short of a religion for atheists. He called it Atheism 2.0, that incorporates forms of tradition to satisfy the human need for connection and ritual and transcendence, but would come without doctrine getting in the way. And again, this is just one sampling, one idea, one inspired bit of creativity. But he said this: what I'm interested in is the kind of constituency that thinks something along these lines, that thinks, I can't believe in any of this stuff. I can't believe in the doctrines. I don't think these doctrines are right. But, and a very important but, I love Christmas carols. I really like the art of Mantegna. I really like going into old churches. I really like turning the pages of the Old Testament and reading its poetry and prose. Whatever it may be, you know the kind of thing I'm talking about. People who are attracted to ritual, to the moralistic, communal side of religion, but just cannot bear its doctrine. Until now, these people have faced a rather unpleasant choice. It's almost as though either you accept the doctrine and then you can have all the nice stuff, or you reject the doctrine and you're living in some kind of spiritual wasteland under the guidance of CNN and Walmart. If you don't believe in religion, there's nothing wrong with picking and mixing, he goes on. with taking out the best sides of religion. And for me, Atheism 2.0 is about both. As I say, a respectful and an impious way of going through religion and saying, what here can we use together? The secular world is full of holes we have secularized badly, I would argue. And a thorough study of religion could give us all sorts of insights into areas of life that are not going well for any of us. And I'd like to run through a few of these today, and that's end of quote. But where he finally arrives is at a vision for new community, an incredibly inclusive community, not much different from our coffee hour, where believer and non-believer can sit down together for all the benefits of communal life, combating isolation and depression, for example, but also bringing all the opportunities to serve the greater good in areas of education, housing, racial reconciliation, you name it. So again, the question, is it possible for us to let go of the gods we have constructed, and perhaps in doing so, find the God and light which is within all of us, no matter whether we believe or cannot, so that we can finally work together to build more inclusive communities and in turn, who knows, find something nothing short of the culture of God, where we can all go about together in peace. Amen.